A leader's legacy remembered and a legend among servants honored. The homecoming for America's 39th president and the things we can learn from the only commander-in-chief from Georgia. We have multiple voices offering their insights on the life of Jimmy Carter. Plus, the discontent among Democrats is not a quiet one. What should Florida's active and engaged take away from Kamala Harris's loss to Donald Trump? Former lawmaker Audrey Gibson has some feedback and suggestions. And the state legislature is back to work gearing up for the annual legislative session. Senator Tom Leek offers his priorities on This Week in Jacksonville. And thank you for joining us today. Jacksonville's Audrey Gibson is in studio, longtime member of Florida's legislature, serving both in the House and the Senator, and so glad that a Jacksonville native is with us today. Thank you so much for being with us. We've spent a lot of time this past week remembering President Jimmy Carter. What are your thoughts there? What did he mean to you? What was your experience seeing those remembrances this week?
And actually, Kent, I watched the entire service and then tried to click in when the president's remains arrived in planes, but I didn't get that. I didn't stay on that long. I was at Florida State, the Florida State University, when President Carter was president. But I seem to remember, I don't know, there was kind of a peacefulness just in terms of the thoughts of my parents, right, or my grandparents, that he was a great guy, right? Not just not just the president, but a really great guy with an awesome personality, and he cared about people.
Yeah, but it's important, right? Important when we see public servants who they wear that on their sleeve. I care about people.
Yes, yes. He was just a plains guy. Yeah,
Plains guy. That's right, Plains, Georgia. We're going to talk a little bit later in our show with our next guest, Rick Mullaney, about President Carter. I asked you to come, and it seemed appropriate to talk about that first, but I asked you to come because I'd seen that you were talking a little bit about the Florida Democratic Party. You were a Democratic leader in the Senate while you were there in Tallahassee. And I read this week that you got some concerns, if not a critique of leadership of the state party, saying, we're not Lawton Child's party anymore. So what are those concerns, and what does that phrase mean?
Well, it means that it's 2025, and last year it was 2024. It's not 19 anything anymore. The electorate has changed. How they receive their information has drastically changed. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And to me, I was leaning more into cultural competency when it comes to leadership at the party, because we don't have cookie cutter voters anymore. We don't have cookie cutter families anymore. We have a lot of cultural communities that hear things differently. They want to be with us, but we have to make sure that we're meeting their needs and understand that we can't just show up, or the state party chair, who I have never seen at my church, can't show up when it's voting time. And you certainly can't show up in churches and religious institutions when it's time to vote. We're not talking to people like we should. And my idea and strategy is to bring people back home, and then gather more. But that requires a lot of data, not just messaging. Messaging is extremely important, because if I tell you I'm hungry and you talk to me about social issues, I can't will you. And social issues are important because they impact everyone. But we have to look at the electorate. We have to listen to the electorate, and we have to know who they are. I was looking at numbers just the other day. When the books closed in Florida, registration books closed in Florida in July, because we're not a two-party system anymore. That's the other thing that I meant in terms of historics. Of course, there's almost 4 million NPAs registered. Democrats were already down by 1 million between Republicans and Democrats. And so when you think about those numbers, you gotta get to work, and you gotta get to talking and make sure people understand.
Well, Senator, you referenced the state party leader. So Nikki Fried, I mean, she spent 4 years as the only statewide elected official as the agriculture commissioner. So she was, in the cabinet under Governor DeSantis. Do you feel like she deserves some of the blame for the defeats we saw in this most recent election cycle?
I think not paying attention to what was happening in the state in terms of voter registration, messaging, talking to people in between time, I think that is a total missed opportunity, and we cannot continue in that vein. I spent a lot of time talking to people in the community, and not just in Jacksonville, right? So I traveled the state as leader to interview Senate candidates. I've been to multiple national conferences as well as international conferences that deals with what's happening in communities and policy. And so the bottom line is, when we can't increase our numbers, we cannot impact policy. And then on top of that, 2 members in the already can't really do anything House left, 2 Democrats left. And I think the current chair's message was not one that should have been delivered. You don't bash, you can't bash the folks because they don't feel like you're meeting their needs. And those
it's
2
the other
people,
way around. You
yes,
gotta meet them where they're at.
Yeah, we'd like to have you back or something. And so we're just off kilter.
Are you interested in leading the Florida Democratic Party? Is that something that you'll pursue?
I am. I actually filed my form in a timely manner, and I'm currently running for FDP state chair.
When will that be decided?
The election will be at our organizational meeting on the 25th.
Of this month?
Yes.
A couple weeks. Coming soon.
Yeah.
Audrey Gibson,
I'm good for it.
Thank you so much. And I appreciate just talking through some of those issues, some of your ideas, and we will follow up with you toward the end of the month and see what happens.
Okay.
Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Kent.
All right, an important week is on the way. President-elect Trump will see some of his cabinet nominees in confirmation hearings. Rick Mullaney explains just ahead on This Week in Jacksonville.
You're watching This Week in Jacksonville with Kent Justice.
And with Rick Mullaney, our Public Policy Institute founder at Jacksonville University. I appreciate getting to talk to you about a wide variety of things, but one of the things that we did this last week, you just heard us talk with Senator Gibson about it, but the funeral proceedings, the ceremony surrounding Jimmy Carter. What were your thoughts there? Because it was really stirring to me as an American, seeing the honor bestowed to the 39th president.
Kent, I thought it was stirring. And it was a 6-day state funeral. And maybe the greatest takeaway, at least for me, was the bipartisan recognition of his extraordinary life. What you saw this past week, at least for a moment, was the laying aside of politics and the laying aside of political differences and the recognition of an extraordinary life. And when you say extraordinary, for a century, this is the only president ever to have graduated from Annapolis. He goes and serves in the military for 7 years. His father dies. He comes back. He's successful as a peanut farmer. But then in the 60s, think about how long ago this is, sort of the shadow of Brown versus Board of Education, and he was ahead of his time on civil rights. But he gets elected to the Florida legislature, to the Senate, and to the Georgia legislature, and becomes Georgia governor. Yeah. Richard Nixon resigns in 1974 in August, and he announces in December of 1974 he's running for president. And nobody knew who he was. It's that post-Watergate era. And remember, he's sandwiched between 2 Republicans, Nixon and Gerald Ford on the one side, and of course Reagan and Bush on the other. And he wins in 1976 in a really stirring upset. And that public service prior to entering the White House, and then his years in the presidency. Now, those years, of course, there's mixed reviews.
Very difficult.
They were difficult. They were challenging. I hope I look younger than this, but I remember those years very well. And so those years were really hard. He had some signature achievements. There's no doubt about that. Go look at Camp David and the peace treaty with Egypt and Israel. Go take a look at the deregulation that he had with the airlines and he had with telecommunications that paved the way for so many things. The appointment of Paul Volcker in 1979 to the Fed and what that meant for inflation in the long run. And many others would point to the establishment of the Department of Energy, of FEMA, education, lots of those things. But there is no doubt that at that time and since, what's been remembered is that runaway inflation, the challenges globally. In 1979, inflation was over 11%. In 1980, the year he ran for president, it was over 13%. You also had the 52 American hostages in Iran for 444 days. And you also had the Soviet Union on the march into Afghanistan, into Central America and Africa. But it was an extraordinary time. He lost to Reagan, of course. But then, remarkably, 2 years later, in 1982, when he established the Carter Center, and for the 4 decades that followed, an extraordinary effort in public service globally, domestically with Habitat for Humanity, but through the Carter Center, going around the globe with global diplomacy, the eradication of disease, watching free and fair elections, and he received the Nobel Peace Prize in 2002. I think there was a domestic and global recognition of a truly extraordinary life.
Yeah, it really interesting. You started your comments with, hey, at least for a time, we saw people set aside the partisanship. And you saw that in the example of President Carter and his predecessor, President Ford, because after they were both out of office, they decided that they would put those things aside and developed an incredible friendship.
Kent, of the beautiful eulogies that were given, and there were many, there were 6, they were beautifully done. One of the ones that truly stood out was Steve Ford, the son of Gerald Ford, who read his father's eulogy. And Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter had become genuinely great friends, something that makes you feel pretty good, actually. This Republican president, this Democratic president. And they had agreed to give each other's eulogies, not knowing who, of course, would go first. And Jimmy Carter did give a eulogy that was very meaningful for the Ford family. And I think Steve Ford delivered an extraordinary eulogy on Jimmy Carter in the words of Gerald Ford.
Yeah. So looking back a little bit here, let's look forward. This is an important week for the incoming President Donald Trump administration. At least a couple of nominations are going to go through the confirmation process in the U.S. Senate. I'm talking about Pam Bondi and Marco Rubio, 2 of the many Florida connections.
Yes, and I expect there are some appointments, of course, that are going to have bipartisan support, and Marco Rubio's at the top of the list for bipartisan support. I certainly expect him to get confirmed. I think Mr. Burgum in Interior is another one that's going to get bipartisan support. In the end, Pam Bondi's going to get confirmed too. I think her hearing may be a little bit more contentious in some ways. They'll explore some things, but in the end, these are big picks. These are big, by the way. Attorney General and Secretary of State. But you can expect this week those confirmations to take place. The more contentious ones lie ahead.
Yeah, and so what is the timing like? Because obviously the 20th of January is when President Trump will be inaugurated. Is there an expectation that some of these cabinet positions, they still won't be filled when he takes office?
Well, I can assure you for President-elect Trump, he wants them done as soon as possible, and he wants it to be expedited, and some of them can be. For others, I think it's going to take a bit. You get to the Secretary of Defense.
That's one that stands out. That is probably going to be contentious.
It does. Pete Hegseth does stand out as contentious, and you're going to see some other ones too. Tulsi Gabbard will be somewhat contentious. Maybe even Robert Kennedy, Patel for FBI. You can see those being a little bit more contentious. The president, of course, wants this on an expedited time frame. I don't think it'll be quite as quick as he wants. He wants everyone in place, of course, by really as soon as possible, but really by February. Remember, there's 1,000, 2,000 picks overall, but that main group, there's about 14 in particular, and of the 14, there's a really important group. That includes Attorney General, that includes Secretary of State, but it does include your FBI director, your Secretary of Defense. Remember, Secretary of Defense, that's the biggest department of all. $900 billion a year, over 3 million employees, that's a pretty big deal.
Any inkling that there's a second choice out there? Months ago, it seems like, we had heard, oh, maybe Governor DeSantis because of his Navy background and whatever. But recently, I've just heard, nope, President-elect Trump is going forward with Hegseth.
There was a time when it certainly appeared that that appointment was in jeopardy and it had no chance of success. It now appears that it shifted, that it favors success. But this is one where you need to wait for the hearing. And while the odds may favor his confirmation, I think this is one where you need to wait for the hearing.
Yeah. Rick Mullaney, I appreciate it. I know I'm going to be covering the inauguration here in just another week, and look forward to more of your commentary on this. Thanks for the time today.
Thanks, Ken.
Tom Leek ran in one of the most expensive Florida Senate campaigns we've ever seen last year, and now he's going to join us and talk about his priorities as he moves from the House to the upper chamber in Florida. That's next on This Week in Jacksonville.
You're watching This Week in Jacksonville with Kent Justice.
And joining us right now, State Senator Tom Leek, newly elected to Florida Senate District 7 after 8 years in the Florida House. And it's good to see you in person. We first visited here on our show, and I think we did that virtually. And we were talking about your role in the budget process. You were leading the Appropriations Committee in the House at that point. What do you see as some of the priorities as we head for Florida, as we head toward this legislative session coming up beginning of March?
Well, first of all, let me say it's nice to see you in person and not be in your mailbox or on your TV.
Right. Right.
You know, so I think we have to work on a couple of things as we go forward this year, and there are a couple of things that are very important to me. One, I want to see property insurance carriers become more responsive to their consumers. You know, we've done a lot of work on reducing property insurance rates. Now, I'll just go ahead and explain. Remember that your premium is a function of the rate that the insurance company charges you, plus the cost of replacement, or times the cost of replacement. Rates have come down. You know, across the board, rates have come down. You've had a couple carriers, you know, stay flat. You've had a couple ask for increase, but we can say that rates are coming down. Those property insurance adjustments that we made to the law are working. What we've had is rampant inflation over the last 4 years. And so the cost of replacement just has outpaced the reductions in the rates. But we still got a lot of work to do. My belief is that if you're going to pay your premium for all those years, when a claim comes time to be due, you deserve to be treated fairly, quickly, and paid.
I can imagine, based on the inflation comment you just made, funding last time when you were in the House side, $117 billion for Florida's budget. Do we see that increasing substantially, staying the same? Any reduction? I would doubt it, right?
Yeah, I don't know that there'll be a reduction in the overall amount of money coming in. Remember, Florida is tied to the revenue that comes in. We can't overspend. So when we pass a budget, it's not money that's been set aside. It's saying this is what we predict is coming in, and if revenue falls short, then there are adjustments automatically to reduce the amount of the budget, amount of things that are being spent. So even if we see an increase in revenue coming in, I think that the budgets you'll see coming out will be flat, if not a little bit down. Now, remember that we had this period of time where the federal government was dumping money on the state of Florida in COVID relief money, and our choices, we had to spend it or give it back to the federal government and watch it fall into the black hole, and we chose to spend it on Floridians. That money's gone. So you're going to see a reduction in the amount of, let's call them member projects, but legislative funding requests that come out of the budget. I think that's going to go down significantly.
Yeah, we tracked that in last summer when Governor DeSantis, after the session is concluded and some of those vetoes come through, and you say, ooh, I thought that money was coming, in this case, to Northeast Florida, and didn't happen. For the future, you've been named chair of the Senate Commerce and Tourism Committee. So what do you hope to accomplish on that committee?
You know, I love that committee. That committee is all things economy in the state of Florida. I'm interested to see what the members bring to us, and I think it is a member-driven project. But as you know, we want to continue to focus on making sure that Florida's economy remains one of the strongest economies in the world. And forgive my number here, I'm not sure where the current number is. I think at one point in time, the state of Florida had the 13th largest economy in the world. Right? So we want to continue to use our power through the committee to make sure Florida's economy remains robust and continues to grow.
There's certainly that agriculture component, but it has tipped over the years. Tourism is absolutely a huge driver of economy here. Let's talk on the national level here. President Trump is going to be inaugurated soon. You served as a delegate of his at the Republican National Convention. Are you attending the ceremony in Washington coming up here on the 20th?
Unfortunately, we're kicking off our heavy-duty legislative schedule. Next week, I start to go to Tallahassee for committee weeks, and so that conflicts with the going to the inauguration, and so I'm going to continue focused on Florida's issues.
One of the Florida things that we saw last summer, this race for your seat in the Senate, it was stunning to us. It was the primary, the Republican primary race for the Senate seat there. So much money poured in. Was that unexpected to you? And maybe describe the dynamics here while we have a couple of minutes.
Yeah, it was not entirely unexpected, because when you take on special interests like I did throughout my 8 years in the House, you know it's coming at you at some point in time. I didn't know whether it was going to be the plaintiff's attorneys, the personal injury lawyers, or whether it was going to be pharma or any number of the special interests that I took on. So you knew it was coming. I didn't know it would be like that, right? And I really feel awful for my wife and my daughters who had to live through that and seeing their dad being beaten up on TV 4 to 6 times an hour.
Per hour, but you're exactly right. Yeah, it was a lot.
I think academically I had an understanding that something was coming. Living it was a whole other thing.
That was, you said special interest group, but this was because of your push for tort reform while you were in the House. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah, one of the things I did is I wanted, and with the the support of Speaker Renner and others, we wanted to make sure that a lot of the garbage lawsuits that you hear about that are filed out there, you think that is really just driving up prices on everyone. And if you want to know what really was the factor of insurance carriers leaving the state of Florida, you remember there was a risk there that we were going to lose any capacity to write insurance because the insurance companies were leaving.
Yeah. They said the risk was too high.
They said the risk was too high. And listen, if an insurance company can't make money, then there's something terribly wrong, right? Because they can figure out how to make money. But one of the things that they said was the problem, and we saw was the problem when we studied it, was the number of lawsuits being filed. And the lawsuits, my rule on tort reform is if you see an area where the lawsuits start to take on more of a flavor about like a cottage industry. They're more about paying the lawyers, they're more about paying the experts than they are about helping the consumer, then we've got a problem. And in that instance, if you looked at every dollar that was spent in the property insurance litigation world, 8 cents of it made it to the consumer. The rest of it was taken by others.
Yeah, so we can see the reason behind your efforts there. State Senator Tom Leek, thank you so much. And we'll check in certainly as we get started with the legislative session in March. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
So I'm Kent Justice. Thanks so much for watching you on air on Channel 4 and the CW17 and then online at news4jax.com or streaming on News4Jax Plus. Now, next week, we will bring you the show live from Washington, D.C. as we cover the inauguration of President-elect Donald Trump. And don't forget to check out This Week in Jacksonville Business Edition. This episode of our podcast, we're breaking down affordable housing in the area with Dr. David Jaffe. You can find new episodes every Thursday at 9 a.m. and you're going to find it right now on News4Jax Plus under the channel This Week in Jacksonville.
See why every day more people are choosing News4Jax, Northeast Florida and South Georgia's #1 source for local news.